Ingmar Bergman, the man who made some of the most aesthetically beautiful films of all time. The Seventh Seal, a film about the approaching abyss of death and finding love in an existence that is seemingly worthless and meaningless. Wild Strawberries, a reflection on aging, guilt, and death, and one's own personal mistakes and regrets in life. Persona, a film that is almost impossible to interpret, but is a beautiful juxtaposition of images that explore identity.
It insists upon itself.
Three of the greatest films of all time, directed by one of the greats of all time. I wonder what his thoughts on his contemporaries were. Cinematographically uninteresting and infinitely boring. Godard is a fucking bore. For me, he's just a hoax. It's empty. Citizen Kane, which I have a copy of, is a total bore. Above all, the performances are a total bore. An infinitely overrated filmmaker. Fellini, Kurosawa, and Buñuel move in similar fields as Tarkovsky. Antonioni was on his way, but he expired, suffocated by his own tediousness. I gotta say, I love when so-called deep and thoughtful filmmakers talk absolute shit about each other. You think Bergman would be a little bit more elegant in his criticisms, rather than just saying, this guy fucking sucks. But who is the biggest shit talker of them all? Well, let's have a look today. Let's start off with a not very pleasant customer, Vincent Gallo.
Ah yes, the man who made one good movie and then dipped. He's kind of a talented actor and director, but other than that though, he is a sexist and bitter asshole. He's talked shit a lot about his colleagues, but honestly, the comments he makes are not even funny. They're just mean-spirited and quite misogynistic. All of these comments are pretty cringy to read, with the exception about a comment he made about Abel Ferrara.
Abel Ferrara directed a film called The Funeral, starring Chris Penn and Christopher Walken, and Vincent Gallo also starred in the film. Here was Vincent Gallo's opinion of Abel Ferrara. Abel Ferrara was on so much crack when I did The Funeral. He was never on set. He was in my room trying to pickpocket me.
Hooray!
Let's not waste our energy on Vincent Gallo, though, because speaking of Abel Ferrara, Ferrara unexpectedly got into a mini feud with one of his biggest heroes in the industry, Werner Herzog. Let's talk about that.
One of Abel Ferrara's most well-known movies is a film called Bad Lieutenant starring Harvey Keitel. If we fast forward to May 2008, the famous filmmaker Werner Herzog was approached by William Finkelstein. The name of the script was called Bad Lieutenant. Finkelstein was aware about Abel Ferrara's original movie, and he emphasized to Werner Herzog that it was not going to be a remake, and Herzog himself even insisted that they change the name to Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans. Ferrara was not happy about this.
I wish these people die in hell. I hope they are in the same streetcar and that it blows up. Wow. And then, here's what Werner Herzog had to say. I have no idea who Abel Ferrara is, but let him fight the windmills. I've never seen a film by him. I have no idea who he is. Is he Italian? Is he French? Who is he? In all fairness, though, this was a pretty harmless feud at the end of the day. It was clearly a misunderstanding between the two filmmakers, and multiple articles have actually suggested that both men have actually made up now and are actually on quite friendly terms. I do understand why Ferrara would have been very offended, though, by Herzog, because Ferrara is a massive fan of Werner Herzog. So ultimately, there was a happy ending when it came to Herzog and Ferrara. But unfortunately, though, there are some friendships that ended pretty badly because of feuds like this, and they never recovered. What am I talking about, though? Well, it's the fallout between Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut.
There are two schools of thought when it comes to Godard. You either think his films are cool, stylish, groundbreaking, and sometimes even powerful, but then there's the other school of thought that will criticize Godard for his sometimes style over substance approach to filmmaking. For example, I do like Breathless, but I remember when I saw it for the first time, I thought the film was kind of boring, just because the story isn't particularly deep or complex. Also, if you're not a fan of filmmakers talking about their politics in movies, then you'll definitely not like Godard, but I'll get to that in a moment.
For those who aren't big fans of Jean-Luc Godard, they'll usually refer to him as being a fake intellect or being a quite pretentious hipster, Where does this idea come from, though?
I don't want to talk too much about this, mainly because it's such a long story in itself, but the reason why Jean-Luc Godard is kind of seen as being a pretentious hipster, quote-unquote, is because, well, he was an asshole. And he looks like a hipster as well. I really do like Godard's films for the most part, but he really drank his own Kool-Aid, and it's because of that personality he had, he rubbed off a lot of people the wrong way, especially filmmakers who really didn't like him for the most part. For example, Orson Welles wasn't the biggest fan of Jean-Luc Godard. He explained that, quote-unquote, his gifts as a director are enormous, I just can't take him very seriously as a thinker, and that's where we seem to differ, because he does. His message is what he cares about these days, and like most movie messages, it could be written on the head of a pin.
Ah, the French.
Werner Herzog also said about Jean-Luc Godard that someone like Jean-Luc Godard is for me intellectual counterfeit money when compared to a good kung fu film. Another highly influential director that's talked about Jean-Luc Godard is none other than Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino on one hand did explain that Godard is what Bob Dylan did to music, they both revolutionized their forms. However, he explained that he wasn't really a fan of Jean-Luc Godard anymore because, quote-unquote, you get into him for a while and he's like your hero for a little bit, you start drawing shit like him and then you outgrow. I think that's what Godard is, at least for me anyway, as a filmmaker. But then again though, if we go down a quick little tangent here, this is kind of like the pot calling the kettle black here, because a lot of people would actually apply what Quentin Tarantino just said to Quentin Tarantino himself. Nick Broomfield, for example, said that it's like watching a schoolboy's fantasy of violence and sex, which normally Tarantino would be wanking alone to in his bedroom while his mother is making his baked beans downstairs, only this time he's got Harvey Weinstein behind him and it's on a million screens. Harmony Korine said about Quentin Tarantino that some of his references are just flat pop culture, and even Jean-Luc Godard himself said about Tarantino that Tarantino named his production company after one of my films. He'd have done better to give me some money. So ultimately, there were films of his where sometimes the story did take a bit of a backseat to his images and his politics, which is why a lot of people thought that he was just a fake intellectual.
There were always somewhat creative differences between Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. For example, Godard liked to write his scripts along as the film was being made, whereas Francois Truffaut always made sure that the script was finished before filming his movies. Godard was a lot more experimental in his filmmaking than Francois Truffaut was. In fact, if we look at the article quickly, it even says, Godard always wanted to reinvent himself with every film. It was typical of Godard, he liked to be reborn from the ashes. He succeeded several times. After all, Jean-Luc Godard is very well known for saying that a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order.
These two men, though, were the best of friends. Until they weren't. In May 1968, there were multiple widespread protests and strikes formed by students. This was against university conditions and government repression. Jean-Luc Godard was very inspired by this, and he wanted cinema to become more political. The events of May 1968 were so bad that it even resulted in the cancellation of that year's Cannes Film Festival. As Godard got older though, his films became even more visual and even more experimental, and his politics were even more upfront in his films. Specifically, his Marxist politics. Truffaut, on the other hand, thought it was a very bad idea to mix cinema and politics together. In 1973, Francois Truffaut released a movie called Day for Night. Now, Jean-Luc Godard apparently was watching the movie in cinemas and he stormed out. Godard wrote a letter to Francois Truffaut and he called him a liar for not providing what he felt was an honest critique of the filmmaking world. He also said as well that, quote-unquote, that the scene between you and Jacqueline Bisset last week at France isn't included in your movie, and one also can't help wondering why the director is the only guy who isn't sleeping around in Day for Night. This was a direct reference to an affair that Francois Truffaut was having with Jacqueline Bisset.
Francois Truffaut had enough of Jean-Luc Godard, and he wrote a very long letter back to Godard. He famously said, and I quote, I have read it and find it disgusting. It is because of this that I feel the time has come to tell you at length that in my view you are behaving like a shit. In fact, actually, the cinematographer who worked on Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless and Francois Truffaut's Jules and Jim, I'll show his name in the background, here's what he had to say about the feud between the two men. Godard was the big loser there, I think. He is not someone who has ever been very easy to get on with outside of work. He fell out with quite a lot of people, including myself. For him, it was never his fault, it was always other people's fault.
Ah, the French.
There are many feuds that I could probably quote. After all, there's a great article I've been using, which you can find in the description right now. But I'm going to end this video by saying one of the harshest insults from one filmmaker to another, and it is from none other than Uwe Boll. This is what he had to say about Michael Bay. And I quote, "I am not a fucking like Michael Bay."
Completely fucking bullshit.
Hope you enjoyed that video, guys. Who do you think is the greatest shit talker when it comes to filmmakers? Please comment below.